Wouldn't have been as good as Mark Lowry. So chapter 17, David and Goliath. Now, again, this whole army is afraid of Goliath. But David's not. He decides he's going to face Goliath. Now, again, if you read the story, you know Saul gives David his own sword, his coat, his armor to wear, and it doesn't work out so well because you read the story and Saul's like a 52 long and David's like a 36 short. But now maybe we can understand why he tries to do this. There's a real good chance that his suit of armor was the only suit of armor that all of Israel owned. Because again, we talked last week that they didn't have that iron technology. But skip down to 1747, and this is the end of all the speeches, and David and Goliath are kind of doing some of this ancient Middle East trash talk, and Goliath says, I'm going to cut you up and feed you the birds, and David says, I'm going to cut you up and feed you to the birds. And at the end of the speech, there's a classic statement from David. I want you to see this, and you'll understand a little bit more about the significance behind this statement. 1747, David's talking to Goliath. He says, all those gathered here, everybody watching, the Israelites, the Philistines, all those gathered here, Goliath, once I win, will know that there's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you all over into our hands. So David says, everybody knows here, okay, everybody knows that this victory, it's not going to come to us because of the weapons that we have. Because again, we learned last week, how many swords and spears they have. They got two, you know, and it said in chapter 13, they've only got two, and they're up against the Philistines, who've got hundreds and thousands of chariots and riders, and it's a remarkable victory that's going to be won. But it's only going to be won because of God. Not because the weapons or the fighters, you know. If it's the weapons or sword deal, they're going to lose every time. You know, the Philistines are going to win every single time. But God is with David, and David wins. And they all go back home. And everybody's celebrating after they go home. And Saul is the commander-in-chief. And you'd think that Saul would be thrilled. But not so much. He's not, is he? Because they're singing David's praises a little bit louder than they're singing Saul's praises. You think a lot more of him. Now David, though, he's loyal to Saul, and David is working for Saul, and he's underneath him, but Saul doesn't like the songs that they're singing. You know, people dance and sing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And the Bible says that Saul was very angry, and this refrain galled him. And he credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but with me only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul had kept a jealous eye on David. So he's consumed with envy. Anybody ever get jealous before? You ever wrestle with envy? I want to share what it can do. From that time on, for the rest of his life, Saul is obsessed. He's obsessed with David. And you think about this, if you've ever had a daughter, or if you're a daughter and you got a dad that loves you, Saul offers not one, but he offers David two of his daughters to marry, purely as a trap to try to kill David. Now, his daughter Michal, she loves David. And this is the only, truly, it's the only woman by name in Scripture where we're told that she loves a man. We're told that Michal loves David. So Saul says to David about his own daughter, David, you know, I know you're poor and you can't afford a dowry. Now think about this. Think about how gory this actually is. He says to David, just bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines and that'll be my daughter's dowry. Now, the reason that he does this, the reason why he says is he figures that if he tries this, that he's going to get killed by the Philistines trying to do it, you know, and the Philistines will do his dirty work. So he uses his daughter as a pawn to kill the only man that she's ever loved. But see, this plot, it backfires. And David ends up killing 200 Philistines, not 100 of them, and brings twice the required dowry that Saul had asked for. So Saul gives David his daughter Michal in marriage because he's forced to. Skip on down to 1828. When Saul realized the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. So Saul here is just living in fear and in jealousy and in hatred, and David continues to day in and day out to work for him. And 3 separate times he tries to kill David by his own hand with a javelin. You ever have a bad relationship with your boss? You ever throw a javelin at you before, you know? That's what Saul does. But David continues to forgive and continues to come in and do those things like a loyal employee does. He forgives him. So Saul becomes so obsessed with David that even when Saul's own son Jonathan tries to defend David, that Saul hurls a spear and tries to kill his own son just for defending David. And through 1 Samuel, the next 10 chapters, Saul just continues this descent. And the more that Saul tries to harm David, the more that God is with him. And David prospers. And it can be argued that Saul just lives in this private hell of fear and jealousy and hatred and insecurities and isolation. And here's what I found. Sin does that to a person. Sin really does. And that's why God hates sin so much. What it does to us. Now, we read about Samuel's death last week, but look at this. The prophet Samuel, chapter 28. Turn there real quick, verse 3. Now, Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. And we're told about this in more detail in chapter 25, but Samuel's dead. But here's a background sentence. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines assembled and came up to set camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid and terror filled his heart. And again, friends, this is one of the themes of Saul's life. It says he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or by Urim. And that's one of the devices that priests would use to try to find out what God's will was. Or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, now catch this, find me a woman who is a medium so I may go and inquire of her. And they told him there's one in Endor. Okay? Now verse 7. Literally when Saul says he wants a woman who's a medium, he says what he wants is a woman who's got a pit. And the way that it kind of worked was like this. Some people had access to caves and sometimes just like fissures in the ground. And they would use these like as a prophet. They would set up some kind of a business and claim that they had access to spirits who lived in the underworld. Now, Saul himself had outlawed this. But again, he was troubled. He wasn't hearing from God. And the Philistines were closing in on him and up to Mount Carmel. And they're within like 15 miles of the Jordan River. So Saul is just terrified. So he says, I'm not hearing from God, so give me someone with a crystal ball. So his advisors went out and found this woman, and there's just tremendous irony in this story. She says, I can't do this. You know, King Saul's outlawed this behavior. Now, this is the irony here, okay? Saul's breaking his own law here. He says, the king will never find out. But see, if you read the story, you see he's in disguise. She says, okay, well, if the king's not going to find out, who is it that you want to see? And Saul says, I want to see the prophet Samuel. And she says, okay, Samuel, come from beyond. And this part of the story is almost kind of comical. This idea that this woman is a fake. You know, she's the medium of Endor. And you think about these people you see on late night TV, like, you know, that Miss Cleo. You ever see Miss Cleo on TV? And it's kind of the way it worked in those days. Somebody would come to Miss Cleo of Endor and say, who do you want to see? And they say, I'd like to see my dead brother because he buried his fortune. And, oh, dead brother, please come forward. And I don't see anything. Put some more money in my hand. And more money they put in the hand. And they would all of a sudden, oh, yeah, now I'm seeing him. But you can't hear him talk. Well, I hear him talk. Put more money in my hand. And the more money, I'll hear him talk. And that's kind of the way it worked. It's like a sham deal, you know. And she's making money out of this. That's by way of background. But Saul comes and says, look into your pit. I want to see Samuel. She says, okay, let's go to the pit. And they look down to the pit. And she says, bring up Samuel. But look at verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice. Now, why do you suppose she did that? Because she looked down and she saw somebody. He was actually there. The pit's working. It's the last thing in the world she expected. It never happened before. And it just flips her out. She's going crazy. And Samuel comes up. And again, this has got to work. And again, Samuel's a little testy. And again, you could probably guess he's just a crotchety old man. And he tells Saul what's going to happen. And by the way, Saul, it's not good news. And he finds out that God is at the end of his patience with Saul. And it's time for David to be the new king. That Saul's time is over. And for 4 decades, he's done enough damage. And now this very next day is going to be a horrible battle, and Saul is going to die, and that's what happens. In fact, you read the text, and it tells us that Saul dies at his own hands. So Saul dies in battle. But I want to turn the corner, okay? The question you got to ask yourself as we're thinking about this whole idea of Saul is, how did this happen? How could Saul sink so low? Because he was God's choice to be the king. But he ends up abandoned and paranoid and insane and desperate and hide himself in disguise and talking to a fraudulent psychic trying to hear from God when he should have direct access to God. How did he sink so low? How did he do that? Well, the text gives us a little clue. Old Testament does. 2 Samuel 2:8, we read about a son of Saul who was briefly crowned king of Israel. And this guy was actually a rival of David for a little while, and he fought against David. And his name in 2 Samuel is called Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. Now, think about this. Nobody in their right mind would name their child man of shame. You just don't name your loving little baby man of shame. Here, meet my baby, man of shame. It'd be like in our day, naming your baby little scum bucket. Don't isn't he cute, little scum bucket? You know, people just don't do that, you know. But even more, we've learned from our previous studies that the name represents the character that their parents hope that the child is going to have one day. Now, we know from doing some history study here, the child's actual name from a parallel account in 1 Chronicle 8:33, his name was Eshbaal. And the name Eshbaal means that man of Baal. So we have Saul, who is the king of Israel, named one of his children the man of Baal. And that tells us that Saul also worshipped this idol Baal. And my guess is that this was just so painful to the people of Israel, when the scribes copied 2 Samuel, it was just too painful to them to write the name Eshbaal, so they changed it Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. But we also know that Saul worshipped Yahweh too, the God of Israel. And one of his sons, named Jonathan, which means Yahweh gives, the Lord gives, he also worshipped Baal, and we know what other gods he might have worshipped. You see, King Saul, the king of Israel, God's chosen people, he made the God of Israel just one among many other gods. And that's in your notes, a syncretist. It's a vocabulary term that you might want to know, because that's very popular in our time right now. You're watching the election, you probably see a lot of this. It's quite common. I'm going to take a little bit from Christianity. I'm going to take a little bit from Buddhism. I'm going to take a little bit from Hinduism and whatever else I can mix in, because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, so I'll just worship everybody's gods and we'll be okay. And this is the problem of almost all the other kings of Israel, except for David. Even David's son Solomon eventually had the same problem. And we'll find almost every one of them except for David. And Old Testament scholars, as I've been reading, suggest this may be the very reason why David is called the man after God's own heart. It may not be that David was remarkably obedient, and we'll talk about that more next week. He was guilty of lust and adultery and deceit and murder. He had 8 wives and 11 concubines. He was really a disaster as a father. He wasn't a remarkably obedient man, but he had one God. And virtually almost all the other kings of Israel would be like Saul. They had been the need of many gods, but not David. And he would fail his one God many times in tragic ways, but David always repented. And he always refused to bend the knee to anyone or anything else. He only had one God, and he was a man after God's own heart. And in your sermon notes, that's how I want to end this morning. I just think it's so important. I want to talk about that for just a few seconds, about that heart that David had. How did he maintain that kind of heart? What was his secret? Again, next week we're going to talk about his shortcomings with Bathsheba and some of his problems with his kids and problems as a king. But I want to close today and give you 3 steps on how you as a believer can develop a heart like David, so that you can be a man or a woman after God's